The last of our microbes that we're going to study are the viruses. And viruses are a bit of a special case because they're kind of on that border between living and non-living. They definitely rely on living things to go through what we'd call their life cycle. But when we look at Mrs. Green, it becomes a bit confusing as to whether they're living or not. Because they rely on a host, another living cell, to do Mrs. Green, we call them obligatory parasites. Obligatory means you have to, so obliged to do something. And a parasite is anything that lives inside or on a host. So ringworm, for example, is a parasite that lives on skin and in skin. You can get things that live inside your intestines that are not good for you. They're parasites as well, that sort of thing. So let's quickly go through Mrs. Green. Can viruses move? They can. It's a bit of a borderline even with movement because they move in droplets of water or on air currents, that sort of thing, but they can move. Do they reproduce? They do, but they rely on a host cell to do that. They don't have a cytoplasm, as it were. They don't have the ability within their structure to actually reproduce themselves, but they do reproduce. They just use a host to do it. Are they sensitive? Definitely. They are sensitive to things like ultraviolet light, heat, that sort of thing. They do have a response to those, and those things can actually destroy them. Are they made up of cells? No. Even though the structure looks cell-like, it's not a cell. It doesn't have some of the key things in it to be called a cell. It doesn't have mitochondria or any way to create their own energy, which is going to get me to respiration in a moment. Growth, do they get bigger? Not really. They get built and they get put together by a host cell. I suppose you could argue that's their growth, but again, it's done by a host cell. Respiration, again, their host cell does respiration, but they do not have the stuff inside them to do respiration, which is why we can't call this a cell. Excretion, you could argue that when they have finished their life cycle and they burst the host cell and destroy it, that dead host cell is their excretion. So I guess you could argue that they do excretion. Nutrition, they do need the raw materials to make more of themselves, but they get their host cell to do that for them. So all those ones I've got question marks next to basically show that they do rely on a living, and it has to be living, doing Mrs. Green itself, a living host cell. So that's why they are obligatory parasites. They need to infect something else to do life processes. The basic structure is really, really basic actually in a virus. It's got genetic material in the inside. Now for viruses, it can be DNA or another version of genetic material called RNA. So this is deoxyribonucleic acid. This is ribonucleic acid. They're slightly different, but they do the same job. They hold genetic information to code for new viruses. So it doesn't matter whether it's a DNA virus or an RNA virus. Interestingly, the DNA viruses tend to mutate more slowly, so they're a little bit easier for us to combat when they cause disease, when they're pathogenic. Whereas RNA viruses, they can mutate a bit quicker, so they're a bit harder for us to deal with when they cause diseases. Outside this, we've got a protein coat, so basically like a shell that's made up of proteins. Now, in a cell, the outside bit, the cell wall and the cell membrane, are made of different things. A cell wall is made of a chemical called cellulose, and a cell membrane is made of fats, basically. It's called a bilipid layer, which allows things to come across it. This doesn't let things in or out. So what it has these other little proteins in it, which allow things to get in and out, and some of them have got jobs to make them attached to their host cell and so on. I'm not showing the life cycle in here because there's a really good diagram in your PowerPoint, and they can be found online very easily too. Now, these proteins on the outside are what help our immune systems recognize these viruses if they are parasites. if they are pathogens, if they cause disease. So our immune system can recognize these things, and when it does, it triggers an immune response. We call these things antigens, and they are recognized by antibodies, something our body makes to fight disease. Now I'm going to use influenza as an example here. Here's 3 different types of proteins or antigens that exist on the outside of an influenza or flu virus. One is the H1N1. So they're given names and numbers by scientists, and this caused the swine flu more recently, and way back 100 years ago it caused the Spanish flu, which was a devastating disease just after World War One. It killed, they don't know how many people it killed actually. The estimates range from 20 to 50 million people. It's remarkable and very devastating and upsetting. H2N2 has the very unfortunate name called the Asian flu. It sort of represents a time when you could actually get away with naming things this way. But this was a disease that came from Southeast Asia and spread quite widely. And it's got a different H protein and a different N protein. The numbers say they're different. And H3N2 is probably the most common one now. It's called the seasonal flu. Different versions of H3N2, they're normally given numbers for the year that they come out. They can be quite devastating as well. But luckily we've got vaccinations that can help us with that. And usually we get vaccinated against this one and a couple of others, whatever's most common each year. So different proteins or different antigens on the outside cause different responses from our immune system. Sometimes we don't recognize them, they make us real sick. Sometimes we do recognize them, or we've been given recognition through vaccination, and we can fight them more easily. If a virus mutates, remember we're talking about its DNA or its RNA, if it mutates, sometimes it makes new proteins on the outside, so new antigens. Now our body doesn't recognize it anymore, and it's got a better chance to infect us and therefore reproduce really quickly inside our cells. Unfortunately, that also makes us sick, which is why these things are parasites. They can make their host very sick. So, viruses, quick recap. They're not really living. But once they're inside a host cell, a living host cell, they do the processes of Mrs. Green, probably apart from C, because they're not a cell. Because they have to go into a host cell, they're obligatory parasites. They have to infect something else. Their structure is really simple, made up of a protein coat and genetic material. The protein coat has got proteins in it that our immune system can recognize called antigens. Different antigens are how we classify different viruses of the same type. For example, different types of influenza or flu.